The ink on the parchment burned silver before settling into the thick fiber. Unbreakable. Hermione set the quill down. She traced the edge of the scroll with her index finger. It was done. She was officially the lead researcher for the Department of Mystery's most prestigious post. And its most lethal. Harry stood behind her in the small, windowless Ministry legal office. He didn't look at the contract. He looked at the heavy, iron-banded door that led down to level 9. "You don't have to do this," Harry said. "I signed it." Hermione said. "It's done." 3 people, Hermione. 3 highly trained unspeakables with decades of experience. And they were careless. "I won't be." Harry crossed his arms. His aura robes were rumpled, exactly the way they always were. He was the head aura, but right now he just looked tired. He looked like a friend who was terrified. "It's the widow's curse," Harry said. "It's not just a puzzle. It actively hunts whoever sits in that chair." The first guy froze to death in July. The second one vanished entirely. The third suffered a complete cardiac arrest with no trace of dark magic. Hermione finished for him. She picked up her satchel. "I read the files, Harry. I know exactly what I'm walking into." "That doesn't make me feel better." "It's an ambient magic entity," she said, her voice dropping into the rapid-fire factual tone she always used when she was nervous. "It feeds on kinetic energy and emotional distress. If I can map the ward parameters, I can isolate the anchor object and dismantle the curse. Nobody else has the arithmancy background to do it. And if it figures out what you're doing before you finish..." She pinned a stray curl behind her ear, her fingers brushing her wrist. "Then I'll just have to be faster than it is." Harry didn't argue. He just sighed. He stepped aside, gesturing to the door. "If you need an extraction, you hit the panic button. Promise me." "I promise. I mean it, Hermione. Don't be a hero. Be alive. If this thing starts getting aggressive, you let the department handle it. You don't try to out-stubborn a curse." "I'm not stubborn," she said. "You're the most stubborn person I know," Harry replied. "I know. Thank you, Harry." She turned and walked down the stone corridor. The air grew colder with every step. By the time she reached the end of the hall, her breath plumed in the air. The heavy iron door stood closed. It had no handle. It operated purely on magical signature recognition. Hermione pressed her palm flat against the iron. The metal bit into her skin like ice. The wards hummed, a low, vibrating sound that rattled her teeth. The door clicked and swung inward. The air inside hit her like a physical blow. It was freezing. The ambient temperature was completely untouched by the Ministry's climate charms. Frost lined the edges of the stone floor. The widow's office. It was subterranean, carved entirely out of dark stone. The walls were lined with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, packed tight with classified texts. A massive oak desk sat in the center. The shadows in the corners didn't seem entirely natural. They seemed to stretch, reaching toward the center of the room. Hermione walked in. The door shut behind her, sealing with a heavy, final sound. The wards locked into place. She shivered. She pulled her robes tighter around herself. It was quiet. Too quiet. She walked to the desk. The previous researcher's notes were still there, stacked in a neat, unassuming pile. A half-empty teacup sat next to the inkwell. The tea inside was frozen solid. The researcher hadn't just stepped out. He had collapsed right where she was standing, his heart completely stopped by a shadow that left no trace. Hermione set her satchel down. She opened the top file. She needed to focus. She needed to map the kinetic wards first. If the entity fed on movement, she needed to know the parameters. She pulled out a stack of parchment. She unlatched a heavy wooden box and retrieved her brass instruments. First, the spectrograph to measure the magical resonance. Next, the kinetic wheel, specifically designed to spin when a curse manifested physical force. She placed them carefully on the freezing wood. She aligned the brass dials with the cardinal points of the room. She was an unspeakable. She had broken 6 major curses in the last 3 years. She was not going to let a cold draft and a bad reputation scare her off. She twisted the final dial into place. The brass was so cold it burned her fingertips. The temperature dropped again. Hermione's teeth chattered. She frowned, reaching for her wand to cast a warming charm. The heavy iron door swung open. The wards didn't scream. The panic alarms didn't blare. Hermione spun around, her wand snapping up. A tall figure stepped into the freezing office. Draco Malfoy. He closed the door behind him. His eyes didn't track her wand. He ignored her face completely. He focused entirely on the corners of the room, tracking the unnatural shadows. He wore a dark dragonhide vest over a crisp shirt. His sleeves were rolled up to the elbows. Faint silver scars spiderwebbed across his forearms, the marks of old, violent magic. Malfoy, Hermione said. She didn't lower her wand. Granger. His voice was exactly the same as it had always been. Drawling. Precise. Cold. He pulled a silver compass-like instrument from his pocket and flicked it open. The needle spun wildly before locking onto the center of her desk. "What are you doing here?" she asked. "Working," he said. He didn't look up. He walked past her, stopping 3 feet from the desk, running the instrument along the edge of the wood. "This is a restricted Department of Mysteries research post," Hermione said. "It's classified level 9. You can't just walk in here." "I didn't just walk in," Draco said. "I was contracted." "By whom?" "The minister," he said. He snapped the silver instrument shut. He finally met her eyes. His gaze was the same striking silver she remembered from school, but harder now. Sharper. "Your predecessor died. The one before him died. The minister decided letting the brightest witch of her age get murdered by a shadow was bad press." Hermione lowered her wand a fraction. "You're a curse breaker. Top of my field," he said flatly. "I don't need a babysitter, Malfoy." "I'm not a babysitter, Granger." He stepped closer. The cold air seemed to warp around him, repelled by the heavy magic clinging to his dragonhide vest. "I'm a heavily armed deterrent for whatever killed the last 3 people who sat in that chair. Now sit down and don't touch anything glowing. I'm the lead researcher on this project. You don't give me orders." Draco's jaw tightened once. He looked at her. He noticed the brass instruments she had aligned on the desk. He noticed her shivering. His hands flexed at his sides, the leather of his gloves creaking softly in the quiet room. "I am contracted to keep you breathing," Draco said. "That means I establish the perimeter. I test the artifacts. You translate the text. We don't cross lines. This entire room is my project," Hermione said. "You can't quarantine my workspace." "I just did." He drew his wand. The movement was fast, perfectly fluid. He didn't point it at her. He pointed it at the four corners of the room, casting nonverbal wards. Blue light snapped into the stone, sizzling like electricity before fading into the rock. Hermione watched the magic settle. It was advanced. It was incredibly precise. "Kinetic barus," she said. She recognized the spell structure immediately. It was the kind of magic they didn't teach at Hogwarts. It was the kind of magic you learned in war. Among others. "They'll interfere with my ambient magic readers. The brass dials need a clean magical frequency to detect the entity. They'll keep you from getting your soul sucked out by a rogue shadow." Draco replied. He slipped his wand back into his holster. "I consider that a fair trade." Hermione took a breath. She forced her voice to remain completely steady. She refused to let him see how much the cold was getting to her. "Malfoy, I appreciate the Ministry's concern. But I work alone. Not anymore. I have an unbreakable contract. I am bound to this room until the curse is broken or my tenure ends." "I know," Draco said. "I read it. Then you know I have to be the one to do the work. I can't have you constantly interrupting my readings with heavy defensive magic." "Do the work," Draco said. He pulled a heavy wooden chair from the corner. He placed it precisely between her desk and the door. "Read your books. Translate your ancient runes. Just do it behind my wards." Hermione watched him. He sat down. He stretched his long legs out, crossing his ankles. He looked completely relaxed. He looked like he owned the room. But his eyes were tracking the shadows again. The silver scars on his arms caught the dim light. "You're staying," she said. "I am. In this office. While I work. Yes. For the next 6 months." Draco finally shifted his focus back to her. The cold in the room was biting, but his gaze was entirely focused. Intense. Unwavering. "Until the curse is broken, Granger. I am not leaving your side." Hermione opened her mouth to argue, but the words died in her throat. She went completely still. She stopped reaching for her brass instruments. She realized exactly how he was looking at her. It wasn't the look of a former school rival. It was the look of someone calculating exactly how fragile she was, and exactly what he would have to kill to keep her safe. She turned back to her desk. She sat down. The wood was freezing under her hands. The silence stretched. It was heavy. Hermione looked at the top file. She didn't read a single word. She was entirely unnerved by the curse's cold air. But she was even more unnerved by the solid, unmoving presence of Draco Malfoy standing guard by her door. He didn't speak. He didn't move. But she could feel him there. This was going to be impossible. Part 2. Proximity measures. 2 days later, Draco shoved the heavy oak reading table 3 feet to the left. The legs scraped violently against the stone floor. The sound echoed off the dark, vaulted ceiling of the widow's office, drowning out the low, persistent hum of his kinetic wards. He stepped back. He assessed the angle. From his station by the door, he could now see the entire surface of the reading table. More importantly, he could see the space exactly behind the reading table. There were no blind spots. The shadows couldn't pool in the corner anymore. It was safer. He didn't care if it ruined the symmetry of the room. He didn't care that the table was now awkwardly jutting into the main walkway. He only cared about the sightlines. He walked over to the secondary research cart. It was loaded with ancient, crumbling texts, delicate brass scales, and unstable magical instruments. He grabbed the heavy iron handle. He yanked it out of the alcove with one sharp pull. "What are you doing?" Draco didn't stop pulling the cart. He dragged it into the center of the room. The wheels squealed against the uneven stone. He positioned it directly under the only functioning Lumos orb in the ceiling. "I'm reorganizing," Draco said. Hermione dropped her quill. The sharp scratch of the nib abruptly ceased. She stood up from her primary desk. Her hair was pinned up with a silver hairpiece, but 3 distinct curls had escaped and were currently resting against the curve of her neck. Draco noticed them immediately. He forced his eyes back to the cart. He checked the wheels, making sure they were locked. "You are moving my workspace," Hermione said. Her voice was sharp. It wasn't the factual, rapid-fire tone she used when she was nervous. It was pure, unadulterated outrage. "I am optimizing the sightlines," Draco replied. He didn't look at her. He began rearranging the heavy tomes on the cart, placing the most dangerous-looking ones toward the center. "You had this cart shoved into a Class 4 blind spot. If the entity manifested in that alcove, it would take me exactly 2.4 seconds to reach you. 2.4 seconds is incredibly fast." Hermione pointed out. She marched around the side of her desk. "It takes 0.8 seconds for a kinetic curse to crush a human trachea," Draco said flatly. "I don't like those odds. The wards would slow it down. The wards are net, Granger. Not a wall. If something slips through, I need a clear path to pull you out." He turned away from her and approached the final piece of furniture. A heavy iron bookshelf containing the predecessor's personal logs. Hermione stepped in front of it. She crossed her arms. The air in the office was freezing. The chill seeped through the thickest layers of clothing. She was wearing 2 layers of heavy wool robes, but Draco could see the faint tremor in her shoulders. She was shivering. She refused to cast a warming charm because it interfered with the delicate calibrations of her ambient magic readers. It was infuriating. Her complete lack of self-preservation was going to give him an ulcer. "Move, Granger," Draco said. "No. I need to slide the shelf forward. You have moved every single piece of furniture in this room except for my main desk. You have boxed me into a 10 by 10 square in the exact center of the office. I can't even reach the reference section without crossing your ridiculous perimeter line. The perimeter line keeps you breathing. The perimeter line is a strip of glowing blue chalk that ruins my concentration," she snapped. "Every time I step near it, it hums." Draco stepped closer. He stopped exactly 1 foot away from her. He was taller than her. He used the height advantage. He looked down at her, keeping his face perfectly blank, completely hiding the fact that his heart was beating slightly too fast just from being in her proximity. "The chalk stays," Draco said. "And the bookshelf moves." "I need those logs," Hermione said. "I need to physically handle them." The previous researcher left traces of his magical signature on the bindings. If I can isolate his signature, I can track exactly what he was doing right before the curse stopped his heart. "You are not touching those logs. I am the lead researcher, and they are saturated in dark magic. I scanned them this morning. The residual energy alone could rot the skin off your fingers in 3 seconds. I have dragonhide gloves. Gloves tear, Granger." Hermione threw her hands up in the air. "Malfoy, I can't solve the curse by looking at it from across the room. I have to interact with the environment. I have to read the texts. I have to feel the magic. You can read them. I will levitate them to your desk. I will turn the pages for you if I have to. But you are not putting your bare hands on an artifact that killed the last 3 people who touched it. You are being completely unreasonable. I'm being completely professional." "Professional?" Hermione let out a short, breathless laugh. "You've been hovering over me like a starved Kneasel for 2 days. You reposition my inkwell so I don't lean too far to the left. You cast a shielding charm on my tea. Your tea was sitting next to a cursed grimoire. I didn't want it contaminated. You are suffocating my process. Your process is suicidal." Draco snapped. His voice echoed off the stone walls. The silence that followed was heavy. The low hum of the wards seemed to suddenly amplify, filling the freezing air between them. Draco breathed out slowly. He needed to lock it down. He was a professional cursebreaker. He had worked in collapsing tombs in Egypt and highly volatile dark magic vaults in Nocturne Alley. He never lost his temper. He never let the clients see him sweat. But this wasn't a standard client. This was Hermione Granger. And for the last 48 hours, she had done nothing but intentionally ignore every safety protocol he implemented, while simultaneously looking entirely too appealing sitting in the freezing cold. He flexed his hands at his sides. The leather of his gloves creaked. "Granger," Draco said. He forced his voice back into a slow, drawling rhythm. "I'm going to move the bookshelf. You are going to step aside. I need the 3rd logbook. I'll get it for you. I need to pull it off the shelf myself to feel the localized temperature drop. That's the only way to measure the decay rate of the magical residue." Before Draco could stop her, she turned around and reached for the iron shelf. He didn't think. He just moved. Draco closed the distance between them in a fraction of a second. He stepped squarely behind her, catching her wrist with his left hand before she could touch the cursed metal. Simultaneously, he placed his right hand flat against the heavy wood of the bookshelf, right next to her head. He completely boxed her in. Hermione froze. Her wrist was small and delicate under his leather glove. He wasn't gripping it hard enough to bruise, but his hold was entirely unyielding. He could feel her pulse racing against his palm. His chest was hovering exactly 1 inch from her back. If she took a breath, she would brush against his dragonhide vest. "Don't," Draco murmured. His voice was low. It vibrated in the narrow space between them. Hermione went completely still. She didn't fight his grip. She didn't try to pull her hand away. The rapid-fire logic and the outrage completely vanished. She turned her head slightly, looking at him over her shoulder. They were entirely too close. Draco noticed the faint ink smudges on her cheek. He noticed the exact shade of gold in her brown eyes. And she smelled incredible. It was a completely irrational detail to notice in a cursed room. But underneath the smell of old parchment and ozone, she smelled like vanilla and something sharp, like bergamot. It hit him squarely in the chest. It felt like a physical blow. His left hand twitched. His fingers curled inward, fighting the violent, instinctual urge to pull her flush against his chest. He caught himself leaning forward, the distance between them shrinking to half an inch. He imagined the precise arc of his wand, breaking the ministry wards and apparating them both out of this freezing tomb. He forced his jaw to unlock. He forced his boots to stay planted on the stone floor. "Malfoy," she whispered. Her voice was breathy, shaken. "Your dedication to academia is inspiring, Granger," Draco said. His voice sounded hoarse, entirely lacking its usual bite. "My dedication to keeping you breathing overrides it." He held her wrist for 1 second longer than necessary. He let his thumb brush over her pulse point. Then he forced himself to let go. He stepped back immediately. The cold air rushed into the space between them, biting and sharp. Hermione turned around. She rubbed her wrist where he had held it. She didn't say anything. Her eyes were wide, tracking his movements. Draco turned his back to her. He pointed his wand at the heavy iron bookshelf and cast a levitation charm. The shelf lifted off the ground with a grinding metallic groan. He floated it across the room, setting it down squarely inside his designated perimeter line. He didn't meet her eyes. He couldn't. If he looked at her right now, his mask would shatter completely. "The third logbook will be on your desk in 5 minutes," Draco said to the stone wall. "Do not cross the blue chalk." He walked back to his post by the door. He sat down in the heavy wooden chair. He pulled out a piece of diagnostic parchment and a self-inking quill. He focused on the parchment. The magical readings were completely normal. The ambient magic was stable. But Draco wasn't reading the numbers. He was looking blindly at the page. His hands were flexing, gripping the edges of the parchment so hard the paper threatened to tear. All he could feel was the phantom heat of her pulse against his palm, and the terrifying, overwhelming realization that keeping her safe wasn't just a job anymore. It was the only thing that mattered. Part 3. The first strike. A week later, Hermione dipped her quill into the inkwell. The metal nib scraped against the bottom. It was her third bottle of ink this week. She dragged the quill across the parchment, carefully copying the sequence of ancient runes from the predecessor's final logbook. The room was freezing. It was always freezing. But she barely noticed the cold anymore. She was entirely focused on the erratic, jagged strokes of the dead researcher's handwriting. And she was entirely focused on the man sitting exactly 12 feet away from her. She didn't look up. She didn't have to. She knew exactly what Draco Malfoy was doing. He was sitting in the heavy wooden chair by the iron door. He was reading a text on kinetic anchoring. His left ankle was crossed over his right knee. His dragonhide gloves were resting on the edge of his designated table. And he was watching her. He always watched her. It had been a week since he had boxed her into the center of the office, drawing his glowing blue perimeter line on the stone floor. A week of absolute, suffocating proximity. Every time she shifted her weight in her chair, he looked up. Every time she reached for a new reference book, he stood up and levitated it to her desk before she could even ask. When she forgot to eat lunch, a tray of sandwiches would miraculously appear inside her perimeter line. He was completely professional. He was ruthlessly efficient. And he was driving her completely insane. "You're holding your breath," Draco said. His voice broke the silence of the office, echoing off the vaulted ceiling. It was drawling. It was precise. Hermione exhaled. A small plume of white vapor plumed in the freezing air. She hadn't even realized she was holding it. "I'm concentrating," Hermione said. She didn't look at him. She carefully translated the next rune. "This sequence is completely chaotic. The predecessor was trying to anchor the entity using blood magic, but he missed a crucial stabilizing variable." "He missed several variables," Draco said, "including the one that kept him breathing." Hermione frowned. She tapped her quill against the parchment. If he had used a standard binding circle instead of a kinetic trap, the entity wouldn't have been able to use the ambient magic in the room to stop his heart. If he hadn't locked himself in a subterranean office with a Class 5 dark anomaly, he'd be playing Exploding Snap in the break room right now. Hermione finally looked up. Draco was leaning back in his chair. The dark dragonhide vest made his shoulders look impossibly broad against the stone wall. His silver eyes were locked exactly on her face. She went completely still. She stopped tapping her quill. The air in the room felt suddenly thick. It wasn't the curse. It was him. It was the absolute, unwavering weight of his attention. "I am going to solve it, Malfoy," Hermione said quietly. "I know you are." Draco said. He didn't blink. "And I am going to make sure you survive the process." He held her gaze for a long, heavy second. Then he smoothly shifted his attention back to his book, turning the page as if nothing had happened. Hermione swallowed hard. She forced her eyes back to the parchment. She couldn't do this. She couldn't spend another 5 months in this room with him. He was supposed to be a bodyguard. He was supposed to be a nuisance. He wasn't supposed to know exactly when she forgot to breathe. She picked up her quill. She focused on the next rune. The brass dials on her ambient magic readers suddenly clicked. Hermione stopped. She looked at the instruments. The needle on the spectrograph twitched. Then it swung wildly to the right, burying itself in the red zone. The kinetic wheel began to spin. The temperature in the room plummeted. It wasn't a gradual chill. It was an absolute, instant absence of heat. The ink in Hermione's well froze solid in less than a second, the glass cracking with a sharp pop. Frost exploded across the stone walls, creeping upward like white ivy. "Granger," Draco said. His voice was a whipcrack in the silent room. He was already out of his chair. His wand was in his hand. "The ambient magic is spiking," Hermione said. Her voice shook, entirely from the sudden, biting cold. She grabbed her own wand, standing up from her desk. "It's the entity. It's manifesting." The shadows in the corners of the room began to writhe. They stretched, pulling away from the stone, forming long, jagged shapes that seemed to devour the dim light from the Lumos orbs. The kinetic wheel on her desk began to spin fast enough to blur. It emitted a high-pitched, mechanical whine. "Step away from the desk," Draco ordered. He didn't work. He vaulted over his designated table, clearing the distance between them in 2 long strides. He stopped exactly at the edge of the blue chalk line, his silver eyes completely wild. "It's pulling from the artifacts," Hermione said. She looked wildly around the room. The heavy iron bookshelf they had moved 2 days ago was vibrating. The dark magic saturated in the predecessor's logs was feeding the anomaly. "It's using the residual magic in the logs as an anchor." "Step back," Draco shouted. A massive, floor-to-ceiling glass containment cabinet on the far wall began to groan. The glass bowed outward, glowing with an unnatural, sickly blue light. Hermione took a step backward. She raised her wand, beginning the incantation for a heavy shielding charm. She didn't finish it. The glass cabinet shattered. It didn't just break. It exploded outward with the force of a bomb. Thousands of jagged, razor-sharp shards of enchanted glass ripped through the air, hurtling directly toward the center of the room. Directly toward her. Hermione didn't even have time to flinch. Draco hit her. He didn't cast a shield. He didn't try to deflect it. He launched himself across the blue chalk line, hitting her squarely in the chest and driving them both hard to the stone floor. The impact knocked the breath completely out of her lungs. Draco twisted in midair, taking her weight and rolling so that he took the brunt of the fall. He pinned her flat against the freezing stone. He covered her entirely with his body. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, pulling his heavy dragonhide vest over her as much as possible. The glass hit. It sounded like a hurricane of razor blades. The shards slammed into the wooden desk, burying themselves deep into the oak. They shattered against the stone walls. They rained down on Draco's back, hitting the dragonhide vest with heavy, sickening thuds. Hermione squeezed her eyes shut. She couldn't breathe. She was completely crushed under his weight. He was trembling. The hailstorm of glass lasted for exactly 5 seconds. Then the wards kicked in. The blue kinetic barriers flared brilliantly, snapping the remaining glass out of the air and dropping it harmlessly to the floor. The room went dead silent. Hermione opened her eyes. It was dark. Draco was completely covering her, shielding her from the light of the remaining Lumos orbs. His chest was heaving against hers. His breathing was ragged, harsh, and much too fast. "Malfoy," Hermione gasped. She tried to move, but he was pinning her arms to her sides. "Draco!" He didn't move off her. He lifted his head. He looked down at her. The world seemed to stop entirely. His face was inches from hers. His silver eyes were wide, dilated, entirely blown out with pure adrenaline and absolute terror. There was a thin cut on his cheekbone where a stray piece of glass had caught him, welling with a single drop of bright red blood. He was breathing so hard she could feel his heart hammering against her ribs. Hermione went completely still. She forgot about the curse. She forgot about the broken glass covering the floor. All she could see was him. Draco's left hand was tangled in her hair. He was cradling the back of her head, protecting her skull from the hard stone floor. His fingers were completely buried in her curls. He watched her. He didn't speak. He just looked at her, searching her face with an intensity that burned right through her. Slowly, entirely unconsciously, his thumb moved. He stroked her jaw. Once. A soft, desperate movement. A physical confirmation that she was actually there. That she was actually alive. The touch was a live wire. It sent a shock of pure heat straight down Hermione's spine. Her breath caught audibly in her throat. The sound broke the spell. Draco jerked back. He realized exactly where his hand was. He realized exactly what he was doing. The terror in his eyes vanished, instantly replaced by the cold, ruthless mask of the Cursebreaker. He rolled off her so fast he practically threw himself backward. He hit the floor kneeling. His wand was already in his hand. He didn't look at her. He swept the room, his eyes scanning the shadows, tracking the shattered remains of the glass cabinet. "Are you hurt?" Draco demanded. His voice was clipped. It was completely stripped of the hoarse desperation it had held a second ago. Hermione sat up slowly. Her hands were shaking. "No. I'm fine. Don't move. There's glass everywhere." "You're bleeding," Hermione said. She looked at the cut on his cheekbone. Draco completely ignored her. He stood up, keeping his wand raised, walking a slow perimeter around the ruined desk. The shadows had retreated. The frost on the walls was beginning to melt, dripping onto the stone floor in small, freezing puddles. The entity was gone. For now. Before either of them could say another word, the heavy iron door slammed open. "Hermione!" Harry Potter burst into the room. His aura robes were flying behind him. His wand was drawn. 3 other auras flooded in behind him, fanning out instantly to secure the corners. The perimeter alarms tripped in the aura office. Harry shouted. He stopped dead when he saw the state of the room. The shredded books. The shattered glass covering every inch of the floor. Harry looked at Hermione, sitting unharmed on the floor. Then he looked at Draco. Draco was standing exactly between Hermione and the door. He had his wand leveled perfectly at Harry's chest. He hadn't lowered it when the auras entered. He looked absolutely feral. He looked like he was ready to curse the first person who stepped within 10 feet of her. Harry lowered his wand slowly. He stared at Draco. A long, highly complicated expression crossed Harry's face. He looked at the protective stance. He looked at the way Draco's body was physically blocking anyone from seeing her clearly. "Malfoy," Harry said. His voice was entirely flat. "You're looking at her like someone's about to steal your wand. Relax, mate. It's just me." Draco's jaw tightened. He held the stance for 1 more second. Then, slowly, mechanically, he lowered his wand. He didn't say a word. He turned around, walked to the far corner of the room, and began casting diagnostic spells on the shattered cabinet, completely ignoring everyone else in the office. "Are you okay?" Harry asked, stepping carefully over the glass to reach her. He offered her a hand. Hermione took it. She stood up. Her knees felt weak. "I'm fine," Hermione said. Harry brushed a piece of glass off her shoulder. The curse? It manifested. It shattered the cabinet. Harry looked at the destroyed room. Then he looked at Draco, who was aggressively casting spells at a broken piece of wood. "He got you out of the way?" "Yes," Hermione whispered. She reached into the folds of her heavy wool robes and pulled out a jagged, 2-inch piece of glass that had somehow slipped past the dragonhide vest. Her fingers were trembling so badly she almost dropped it. Her heart was hammering wildly against her ribs. She couldn't catch her breath. But as she looked at Draco's rigid back across the room, she knew the panic had absolutely nothing to do with the widow's curse. It had everything to do with the searing heat of his gaze right before he let her go, and the terrifying realization that she never wanted him to stop looking at her like that. Part 4. The crack midnight. The widow's office was dead silent. It was past midnight. The shattered remains of the glass containment cabinet had been swept into a corner, held in place by a localized stasis charm. The heavy oak desk was scarred with deep, jagged gouges where the enchanted glass had buried itself. Draco was sitting in his chair by the door. He was entirely motionless. He hadn't stopped seeing the explosion since it happened. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the glass bowing outward. He saw the sick, blue light of the entity. He felt the terrifying, split-second realization that he was too far away. He had barely made it. If he had been a fraction of a second slower, if his boots had slipped on the freezing stone, she would be dead. The Department of Mysteries would be sending an L to Harry Potter. He would have failed. Draco swallowed hard. His throat felt completely raw. He looked across the room. Hermione was sitting at her desk. She was working. She had been working for 6 hours straight since the auras left. She had refused to leave the room. She had refused to stop translating the third logbook. She claimed the entity's manifestation pattern was directly tied to the sequence of runes she was decoding, and she couldn't afford to break her concentration. It was absolute madness. The temperature in the office had stabilized slightly, but it was still freezing. The ambient magic was thick and heavy, a constant, oppressive weight on the chest. Draco watched her. Her hair was a complete mess. The silver hairpiece had fallen out hours ago. Her heavy wool robes were dusted with a fine layer of pulverized glass that she hadn't bothered to vanish. She was shivering. It was a small, consistent tremor that started in her shoulders and traveled down her arms. She was gripping her quill so tightly her knuckles were white. But what Draco was looking at wasn't her shivering. He was looking at her right wrist. When he had tackled her to the floor, a single, tiny shard of glass had slipped past the heavy fabric of her robes. It had grazed the delicate skin just below her palm. It wasn't a deep cut. It barely bled. She had wiped it away with the back of her hand and completely ignored it. But it wasn't a normal piece of glass. It had been saturated in the dark magic of the cabinet. For the last 2 hours, Draco had watched the skin around the tiny cut turn a bruised, ugly shade of violet. The dark magic was spreading. It was slow. It was entirely localized. But it was there, creeping into the veins of her wrist like ink dropped into water. Hermione hissed in a breath. She dropped her quill. She rubbed her right wrist with her left hand, massaging the joint. She didn't look at the bruise. She just rubbed it, her brow furrowed in frustration, before picking up the quill again. Draco stood up. His heavy boots made a dull, echoing sound against the stone floor. He crossed the blue chalk line. He didn't ask for permission. Hermione didn't look up from her translation. "I'm almost finished with the third paragraph, Malfoy. Just give me another 20 minutes. Put the quill down, Granger." His voice was entirely stripped of its usual drawl. It was low. It was utterly uncompromising. Hermione kept writing. "The syntax here is completely inverted. If I can just reverse the polarities of the binding sequence, I can." Draco reached across the desk. He didn't snatch the quill. He just placed his gloved hand over hers, pressing her fingers flat against the parchment. Hermione stopped talking. She looked up at him. He was standing right over her. The shadows of the office played across the sharp angles of his face. His silver eyes were dark, unreadable, and intensely focused on her hand. "Malfoy," she said. Her voice was sharp, a clear attempt to re-establish her authority. "I am working. You have a cursed laceration on your right wrist." Draco said, "The necrotic energy is currently spreading into your carpal tunnel. If you keep using that hand, the magic will fuse with your nervous system." Hermione blinked. She looked down at her wrist. The violet bruising had spread in a spiderweb pattern over her veins. It looked terrible against her pale skin. "Oh," Hermione said softly. She frowned. "I didn't realize." "I know. I can just cast a basic cleansing charm on it. It's fine." She reached for her wand with her left hand. Draco caught her left wrist before she could touch the wood. "A basic cleansing charm will drive the dark magic deeper into the bone," Draco said. "It requires a specialized extraction sequence." "Then tell me the sequence." "No." He stepped around the heavy oak desk. He didn't ask her to move. He pulled the quill out from under his hand and tossed it onto the parchment. He knelt on the freezing stone floor right beside her chair. Hermione shifted backward instinctively, her knees hitting the underside of the desk. "Malfoy, what are you doing?" "I'm doing my job," Draco said. Avoiding her eyes was the only way to keep his hands steady. He took her right hand, incredibly careful as he supported her elbow with his left, resting her forearm across his raised knee. Biting down on the heavy leather, he pulled off his right dragonhide glove. He tossed the glove onto the desk. His bare hand was pale, the knuckles slightly scarred. He traced the edge of the bruised, violet skin with the absolute tip of his index finger. Hermione drew in a sharp, shaking breath. "Does it hurt?" Draco asked. His voice was barely a whisper. "It's cold," Hermione admitted. "It aches." "It's a necrotic freezing curse," Draco murmured. "It was laced into the glass. It feeds on movement. That's why writing made it spread." He drew his wand with his bare hand. The physical proximity was overwhelming. He was kneeling beside her. Her leg was pressed against his side. The scent of vanilla and bergamot completely drowned out the smell of ozone and old dust in the office. He had spent the entire week fighting to keep his distance. He had spent the entire week building walls, drawing chalk lines, maintaining a cold, professional mask that he used to keep everyone out. The explosion had cracked the mask. Kneeling here, holding her delicate, bruised wrist in his hand, the mask completely shattered. Draco didn't care about the ministry contract anymore. He didn't care about professional boundaries. He just needed to get the dark magic out of her skin. He needed her to be entirely safe. He pointed the tip of his wand directly at the center of the tiny cut. He began the incantation. It wasn't a standard ministry spell. It was an old, highly complex piece of pure-blood healing magic. He chanted the words perfectly under his breath, the syllables completely flawless. A warm, golden light flared from the tip of his wand. It sank into her skin. Hermione gasped. Her fingers curled inward, gripping the fabric of his dark vest. "Steady," Draco said. He didn't stop the chant. He moved his left hand, sliding it up her forearm to grip her just below the elbow, holding her arm completely still. The The golden light flared brighter. The violet bruising beneath her skin began to shift. It forced the healing magic. The temperature in the room seemed to drop another 10 degrees as the curse resisted extraction. Draco's jaw tightened. He poured more power into the spell. The silver scars on his own arm began to ache in response to the heavy magical output. He didn't care. The golden light pushed the violet darkness back. It gathered the necrotic energy, pulling it up toward the surface of the cut. Draco finished the incantation. With a sharp flick of his wrist, he pulled the wand away. A tiny wisp of black smoke hissed out of the cut and vanished into the air. The bruising on her wrist instantly faded, the skin returning to its normal, pale color. The tiny cut sealed itself closed, leaving absolutely no mark behind. Draco dropped his wand. It hit the stone floor with a clatter. He didn't pick it up. He kept his hands on her arm. His left hand was still wrapped around her elbow. His bare right hand was cradling her wrist. The silence in the office was deafening. Draco was breathing heavily. The magical exhaustion from the specialized extraction was real, but it wasn't what was making his chest heave. He looked at the unblemished skin of her wrist. He looked at the way her fingers were still curled tightly into the fabric of his vest. "You don't take care of yourself," Draco murmured. His voice was entirely stripped of its usual bite. There was no sarcasm. There was no coldness. It was just a raw, unshielded admission. Hermione was completely still. She didn't pull her hand away. "I was just finishing the translation. You were letting a necrotic curse fuse to your nervous system because you wouldn't stop working." Draco finally looked up. He met her eyes. She looked exhausted. She looked terrified. She looked absolutely beautiful. "You don't understand," Hermione whispered. Her voice was shaking. "If I don't solve this, if I don't break the anchor, the entity is going to keep manifesting. It's going to get stronger. It's going to hurt you." Draco froze. He stared at her. He processed the words. He processed the absolute desperation in her brown eyes. She wasn't ignoring the injury because she cared about the research. She was ignoring the injury because she was trying to protect him. The realization hit him like a physical blow. All the air rushed out of his lungs. The heavy, unyielding walls he had built around his heart collapsed entirely. Draco didn't think. He didn't calculate the risk. He just let go. Shifting his grip on her hand, he turned her wrist over, exposing the pale skin on the inside of her arm right over her pulse point. Draco lowered his head. He pressed a warm, incredibly gentle kiss to the inside of her wrist, right where the dark magic had been. Hermione let out a small, broken sound. Her whole body shuddered. Draco didn't pull away. He rested his forehead against the inside of her arm. He closed his eyes. "You're going to be the death of me, Granger," Draco said quietly into her skin. He felt her trembling. He felt the wild, erratic racing of her pulse against his mouth. Slowly, hesitantly, her free hand moved. Her fingers brushed the top of his head. She touched the soft, pale blonde hair at the nape of his neck. It was an incredibly tender gesture. It was completely unguarded. Draco exhaled a long, shaky breath. He turned his head slightly, resting his cheek against her arm. He let her fingers tangle in his hair. He didn't want to move. He never wanted to move again. They stayed like that for a long time in the freezing, ruined office. The low hum of the kinetic wards was the only sound in the room. The cold was still biting, but Draco didn't feel it. He only felt the absolute, overwhelming warmth of her hand in his hair. Eventually, the adrenaline from the explosion and the healing magic caught up with her. Her fingers slowed their movement. Her breathing deepened, evening out into the slow, rhythmic cadence of sleep. Draco lifted his head carefully. Hermione was asleep. Her head was resting against the high back of her heavy wooden chair. The exhaustion had completely overtaken her. Draco let go of her wrist, moving incredibly slowly so he wouldn't wake her. Draco stood up, retrieving his wand from the floor. Rather than waking her up to enforce ministry protocol, he left her resting at the primary research desk. He walked to the coat rack by the door. He pulled down his heavy, fur-lined winter cloak. It was charmed with permanent warming spells, designed for extended expeditions in the frozen north. Carrying it back to the desk, he moved quietly. He draped the heavy cloak carefully over her shoulders. He tucked it around her arms, making sure it covered her completely. He lingered for a second, his hands resting on her shoulders over the thick fur, feeling the steady rise and fall of her breathing. She looked small in the massive chair, completely swallowed by his dark cloak. Draco knelt down beside her chair again. Abandoning his post by the door, he ignored the sightlines and the blue chalk perimeter. Draco sat on the cold stone floor. He rested his forearm on the armrest of her chair. He rested his forehead against his arm, his face inches from her hip, placing himself directly between her and the rest of the dark, cursed room. He was completely surrendered. The danger of a cursebreaker falling in love with a client was obvious. It compromised his objectivity. It made him vulnerable. It made him terrified. But as he listened to her quiet breathing in the freezing room, Draco realized he didn't care. He would tear down the entire department of mysteries stone by stone before he let anything in this room touch her again. Part 5. The full 3 days later, Hermione stared at the parchment. The arithmetic sequence was incredibly complex. It spanned 3 separate scrolls, the ink looping and crossing out previous miscalculations. Her eyes were burning. She hadn't slept for more than 4 hours at a time since the night the glass cabinet exploded. She traced the final variable with the feathered tip of her quill. The predecessor hadn't just missed a stabilizing variable. He had completely misunderstood the nature of the entity. He had treated it like a poltergeist, trying to trap it in a localized kinetic ward. But it wasn't a poltergeist. It was a parasitic echo. It didn't feed on movement. It fared on the magical exertion required to create the movement. That was why the kinetic wards didn't stop it. They just provided it with an endless buffet of raw magic. The anchor wasn't a physical object in the room. The anchor was the warding stone buried directly beneath the center of the office. "I've got it," Hermione whispered. The words were barely audible, but Draco heard them. He was sitting in the wooden chair across the room, exactly where he had been for the last 3 days. Since the night he had healed her wrist, the distance between them had completely vanished. He didn't bother drawing the blue chalk lines anymore. He didn't pretend to be reading diagnostic reports. He just watched her. Draco stood up immediately. He crossed the room, stopping directly behind her chair. He didn't touch her, but she could feel the heat radiating from him in the freezing office. "Explain," Draco said. "It's the warding stone," Hermione said, her voice rushing out in a breathless, rapid-fire stream. The predecessor tied the kinetic traps directly into the structural wards of the Department of Mysteries. The entity is using the Ministry's own ambient magic as an anchor. That's why it's so cold in here. It's draining the entire sublevel. Draco's eyes narrowed. He looked at the sequence on the parchment. If the anchor is the warding stone, you can't just shatter it. It would bring the ceiling down on our heads. I don't have to shatter it, Hermione said. She stood up. Her knees were stiff from sitting for so long. I just have to invert the polarities. If I reverse the flow of the kinetic traps, the entity won't be able to feed. It will be forcefully severed from the anchor. How long will that take? The unbinding spell is 24 syllables. It has to be cast directly over the center of the room. Hermione grabbed her wand from the desk. It will take exactly 8 seconds. 8 seconds is a lifetime in a cursed room, Granger. It's the only way. Draco didn't argue. He drew his wand. He stepped away from her, walking toward the absolute center of the office, right where he had originally drawn his blue chalk perimeter. I'll take the center, Draco said. I'll cover you. No, Hermione said. She stepped out from behind the heavy oak desk. I have to be the one to cast it. I'm the one who calibrated the arithmancy. If the wand movements aren't perfectly aligned with the equation, the feedback loop will kill us both. Draco's jaw tightened. He looked at her. He looked at the exhaustion bruising the delicate skin under her eyes, and the absolute, unyielding determination in her posture. He nodded once. You cast the unbinding. Draco said softly. I'll handle the entity. Hermione walked to the center of the room. The stone floor here was colder than anywhere else in the office. The air was heavy, practically vibrating with ambient magic. She stood directly over the hidden warding stone. She raised her wand. She took a deep breath. She began the incantation. The first 4 syllables left her lips in a steady, rhythmic chant. The room reacted instantly. The widow's curse was parasitic, but it possessed a terrifying, instinctual intelligence. The moment the first polarity shifted, the entity realized exactly what she was doing. It realized it was about to starve. The temperature in the office plummeted so fast the moisture in the air instantly crystallized into a thick, blinding fog. The lumos orbs on the ceiling shattered simultaneously. The room plunged into absolute darkness, illuminated only by the sickly, unnatural blue glow of the entity. The shadows didn't just ride this time. They detached from the stone walls. They pooled together, rapidly forming a massive, shifting mass of freezing, jagged darkness in the corner of the room. It let out a sound. It wasn't a scream. It was a low, vibrating hum that rattled the bones in Hermione's jaw. It lunged. Malfoy! Hermione yelled. She didn't stop the chant. She couldn't. If she broke the sequence, the backlash would be catastrophic. Draco was already moving. He didn't cast a shield. He didn't try to deflect the massive, rolling wave of dark magic. He stepped squarely into the center of the room. He placed himself perfectly, absolutely between Hermione and the charging shadow. I'm not going to let it touch you, Draco said. His voice was completely steady. He didn't even sound afraid. He sounded like a man who had already accepted the math of the situation. His wand was raised, his stance wide and unyielding. Hermione kept chanting. The syllables tore from her throat. 6. 7. 8. The entity surged forward, the blue light flaring violently as it closed the distance. The cold radiating off it was so intense it burned. Draco, it will stop your heart. Hermione screamed, her voice breaking on the final syllable of the second stanza. Then work fast, Granger. Draco replied. The shadow hit him. The impact sounded like a thunderclap inside the subterranean office. Draco didn't scream. His entire body violently arched backward. The sickly blue light of the entity slammed directly into his chest, entirely bypassing the heavy dragonhide vest. It sank straight into his ribs, searching for the massive, beating kinetic energy of his heart. Hermione watched him take the hit. The sight of it ripped through her with a force that was infinitely more agonizing than any curse. She didn't stop the chant. Tears burned hot against her freezing cheeks. Her wand hand was shaking violently, but she forced the movements to remain perfectly precise. She traced the final, complex geometric arc in the air, her voice rising over the deafening hum of the entity. Draco was still standing. He was holding the line. His teeth were gritted, blood dripping from his nose as the dark magic aggressively flooded his system. He was using every ounce of his own highly volatile, dark magic resistance to slow the entity down. He was buying her time. With his life. 22. 23. Draco's knees buckled. He dropped to the stone floor, his wand slipping from his lifeless fingers. The blue light flared brilliantly in his chest as the curse finally breached his heart. 24. Hermione slashed her wand downward, screaming the final syllable of the unbinding spell. A shockwave of pure, blinding white light exploded from the tip of her wand. It hit the stone floor. It blasted straight through the rock, slamming into the warding stone buried beneath them. The kinetic polarity instantly inverted. The entity shrieked. The sound was deafening, a high-pitched mechanical whine of pure agony. The shadow was forcefully ripped out of Draco's chest. It was violently severed from the warding stone, thrashing wildly in the air for exactly 1 second before the inverted magic crushed it entirely. The blue light shattered into 1,000 harmless, fading sparks. The widow's curse was broken. The room went instantly, terrifyingly quiet. The oppressive, freezing weight of the ambient magic vanished. Draco! Hermione dropped her wand. She threw herself onto the stone floor, sliding the last 2 feet to reach him. He was lying on his back. His eyes were closed. His skin was the color of ash. Hermione slammed her hands onto his chest. He wasn't breathing. Panic, absolute and blinding, consumed her entirely. She didn't think about the ministry. She didn't think about the research. No, 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 Hermione sobbed. She ripped the heavy dragonhide vest open, her hands tearing at the buttons of his crisp shirt. She pressed her ear flat against his bare chest, right over his heart. Nothing. There was no heartbeat. Draco, please. Hermione screamed. Scrambling backward, Hermione grabbed her wand from the floor. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely grip the wood, but she managed to point the tip directly at his sternum. Bypassing standard healing diagnostics entirely, she went straight for the most aggressive, highly restricted cardiac resuscitation spell in the Ministry database. The magic erupted from her non-verbally, fueled by every single ounce of her terror and her absolute refusal to let him die. A sharp spark of red magic snapped from her wand and hit his chest, Draco's body jerked upward. Hermione dropped her wand. She pressed both hands flat against his chest again, waiting in absolute, agonizing terror. 1 second. 2 seconds. Underneath her palms, she felt a heavy, erratic thud. Then another. Draco gasped. His eyes flew open, the silver irises blown wide with shock. He took a massive, ragged breath, his chest heaving violently under her hands. He coughed, turning his head to the side as his lungs desperately pulled the suddenly warm air of the office into his system. Draco! Hermione choked out. She collapsed forward. She didn't care about professional distance. She didn't care about anything. She threw her arms around his neck, burying her face in the curve of his shoulder, holding onto him as tightly as she physically could. Draco was entirely rigid for a fraction of a second. He was completely stunned. Then he felt her trembling. He felt her tears soaking into his shirt. Slowly, his arms came up. He wrapped them tightly around her waist, pulling her flush against his chest, burying his face in her messy curls. He was breathing heavily, his heart hammering an erratic, frantic rhythm against her own. But he was alive. They stayed on the stone floor, surrounded by the shattered glass and the fading sparks of the broken curse. Hermione clung to him, sobbing quietly into his shoulder, absolutely shattered by the terrifying realization of just how close she had come to losing him. And as Draco held her, his hand cradling the back of her head, he knew with absolute certainty that he would take the curse 1,000 times over if it meant she got to walk out of this room alive. Part 6. The resolution. 2 days later, the ceiling of St. Mungo's private ward was painted a sterile, blinding white. Draco had been looking at it for 48 hours. His chest felt tight, a lingering phantom ache where the dark magic of the widow's curse had slammed into his ribs and forcibly stopped his heart. The healers had been entirely baffled by the sheer volume of necrotic energy he had absorbed. They had been even more baffled by the violently aggressive, highly restricted ministry resuscitation spell that had brought him back. He hadn't told them who cast it. He hadn't needed to. You died for 3 seconds, Malfoy. Draco slowly turned his head away from the ceiling. Harry Potter was standing at the foot of his hospital bed. The head Auror was wearing his official ministry robes, but he looked as tired as he always did. He dropped a thick stack of official parchment onto the mattress. The Department of Mysteries finalized the report, Harry said. The warding stone is shattered. The entity is completely dissolved. The widow's office is officially just an aggressively cold basement room now. It took 3 teams of Aurors to clear the residual kinetic backlash, but the curse is broken. Draco didn't look at the paperwork. And Granger? She's fine, Harry said. Not a scratch on her. Exhausted, terrified, and currently rewriting the entire department's protocol on ancient rune translation. But physically fine. Draco let out a slow, careful breath. The tightness in his chest eased a fraction. Next time, try ducking, Harry said. Draco raised an eyebrow. If I had ducked, Potter, she would be the one in this bed. Or worse. That wasn't the contract. Right. The contract. Harry crossed his arms. A long, highly complicated expression crossed his face, entirely reminiscent of the look he had given Draco when he had burst into the shattered office a week ago. Harry didn't look angry. He looked like he was finally accepting a reality he had been trying very hard to ignore. The minister signed off on your hazard pay this morning, Harry said. Your assignment is officially terminated. You don't have to guard her anymore. I'm aware of how contracts work. Draco drawled. His voice was hoarse, but the bite was returning. Harry watched him for a long moment. Then, very faintly, the corner of his mouth twitched upward. She hasn't left the waiting room since we brought you in, Harry said quietly. She slept in a plastic chair for 2 days because she refused to go back to her flat until the healers cleared you. Draco went completely still. His hands tightened in the sterile white sheets. Harry turned toward the door. He paused with his hand on the handle. He didn't look back at Draco, but his voice carried clearly across the quiet ward. Take care of her, Malfoy. Harry opened the door and walked out. Draco glared at the empty doorway. His heart, which had been perfectly steady for 2 days, suddenly began to hammer an erratic, heavy rhythm against his ribs. He didn't have to wait long. Less than a minute later, the heavy wooden door creaked open again. Hermione stepped into the room. She looked terrible, but simultaneously absolutely beautiful. Wearing a soft, oversized maroon sweater that hung off her shoulders, she looked smaller than usual. Her hair was a wild, untamed mess of curls pulled into a loose knot at the base of her neck. Dark, bruised shadows of exhaustion lived permanently under her eyes. Her knuckles were white from gripping a thick stack of files so tightly against her chest. Draco watched her. He didn't say a word. He just let himself look at her, completely unshielded. She walked slowly toward the bed. She stopped exactly 3 feet away. The healers said your magical core is stabilizing. Hermione said. Her voice was too bright. It was thin and brittle, completely stripped of its usual factual confidence. It is, Draco said. And your cardiac rhythm is normal. Yes. Hermione nodded tightly. She looked down at the files in her hands. I brought the revised translation notes. The department wants to properly archive the predecessor's logs, and I thought since you were intimately familiar with the localized dark magic, you might want to review the containment variables before I submit them. Draco looked at the files. Then he looked at her face. She was terrified. She had just spent 2 days sitting in a plastic chair waiting to see if he was going to live, and now she was hiding behind ministry paperwork because she didn't know how to bridge the gap. The widow's curse was gone. The contract was over. The absolute life or death stakes that had forced them together on the floor of the cursed office were gone. Now, it was just them. Put the files down, Granger, Draco said softly. Hermione froze. Her fingers tightened on the cardboard. But the containment variables. I don't care about the containment variables. Hermione swallowed hard. She slowly lowered the stack of files onto the rolling tray table at the end of the bed. Her hands were shaking. Without the files to hold onto, she crossed her arms tightly over her chest, hugging herself. She wouldn't meet his eyes. She glared down at the sterile white blanket covering his legs. You stopped breathing, Hermione whispered. The brittle brightness was completely gone from her voice. It was replaced by a raw, devastated sound that cracked right down the middle. I know, Draco said. Your heart stopped completely. I cast the resuscitation spell and nothing happened. For 3 seconds, absolutely nothing happened. A single tear spilled over her eyelashes, cutting a clean track down her pale cheek. She reached up and wiped it away furiously with the sleeve of her oversized sweater. I thought I killed you, she said, her voice shaking violently now. You stepped right into it. You didn't even try to shield. You just let it hit you to buy me time. Draco pushed himself up in the hospital bed. The movement pulled painfully at his ribs, but he completely ignored it. He reached out. He didn't ask for permission. He caught her wrist, the same wrist he had healed in the freezing dark of the office, and pulled her gently toward him. She didn't resist. She stumbled forward, ending up standing right beside the mattress. "Granger," Draco murmured. He kept his hand wrapped around her wrist. "Look at me." She shook her head. Another tear fell, dropping onto the sterile white sheets. Draco let go of her wrist. He reached up, sliding his hand into the messy curls at the nape of her neck. His fingers were warm. He applied a gentle, unyielding pressure, tilting her head up until she was forced to look at him. Her brown eyes were shining, completely wrecked with guilt and exhaustion. "I told you," Draco said, his voice low and incredibly steady. "I told you I wasn't going to let it touch you. I meant it." "You could have died permanently," Hermione choked out. "I didn't." "You shouldn't have done it." "I would do it again." The absolute certainty in his voice silenced her completely. Draco let his thumb brush against the side of her neck, right over her wildly beating pulse point. The physical contact was an electric shock, burning away the last lingering shadows of the curse. He didn't want to talk about the Department of Mysteries anymore. He didn't want to talk about wards or anchors or dark magic. "The contract is officially terminated, Granger." Draco murmured. He applied pressure to the back of her head, pulling her down toward him. Hermione let out a small, fractured breath. Her hands came up, resting flat against his chest to steady herself. She was incredibly careful not to press on his ribs, but she didn't push away. "Which means," Draco whispered, his lips hovering a fraction of an inch from hers, "I don't have to be professional anymore." Hermione's eyes fluttered shut. Draco closed the distance. He kissed her. It wasn't a rushed, desperate collision of terror and adrenaline like it would have been on the floor of the cursed office. It was slow. It was deliberate. It was incredibly, overwhelmingly warm. It tasted like coffee and hospital antiseptic and the absolute, dizzying relief of survival. Hermione melted against him. All the rigid tension holding her together completely vanished. Her fingers curled into the fabric of his hospital shirt, anchoring herself to him, her breath hitching softly into his mouth. Draco shifted his weight, ignoring the ache in his chest, pulling her down until she was sitting on the edge of the mattress. He tangled both his hands in her wild curls, holding her exactly where he wanted her. He kissed her until the sterile smell of St. Mungo's vanished entirely, replaced by the scent of vanilla and bergamot. He kissed her until he could feel her heart hammering a steady, perfect rhythm against his own. When he finally pulled back, he didn't go far. He rested his forehead against hers. Hermione was breathing heavily. Her lips were flushed, her eyes blown wide and dark. The devastating guilt was entirely gone from her face. She looked absolutely wrecked in the best possible way. "You're a menace, Malfoy." Hermione whispered. "I am a highly decorated professional," Draco corrected softly, trailing his thumb along her jawline. "Who is currently off the clock." Hermione let out a breathless laugh. She leaned forward, resting her head in the curve of his shoulder, exactly the way she had on the freezing stone floor 3 days ago. But this time, there was no terror. There were no shadows creeping from the corners. Draco wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her flush against his side. He buried his face in her hair. The cold of the widow's office was gone. The curse was broken. The heavy, unyielding walls he had carried around his heart for years were completely shattered. And as she curled against him in the quiet hospital ward, Draco knew with absolute certainty that he was never putting them back up again. The widow's curse had brought them together, but it was over. He was finally, truly, keeping her. The end.